Live from the Glasgow Electric Blackboard, Glasgow Wants to Know. With your host, Mr. Uhel Barrickman.
Welcome to another in the series of Glasgow Wants to Know. Tonight our subject is Barron County history. We have as our guest a veteran, a Boy Scout leader, a former teacher in the Glasgow Independent School District system, a widely read historian, and an expert on Barron County history, Mr. Jimmy Simmons. As we proceed here this evening, if you have questions that you would like to ask Mr. Simmons in regard to Barron County history, please call 651-8341 with your question or questions. Mr. Simmons, let's start the evening by discussing what Indians, if any, was in what is now Barron County before the white settlers came here.
We never had any tribes that lived here with any recent time. Of course, we had the mound builders here, but that was so far back. That was long before the advent of the white man. But evidently there were small bands that lived through here because, now the Shawnees on the north and the Cherokees on the south, they were on through here and hunted each other lots of times. But we only had little small sort of outcast groups that lived in here. But the mound builders, some people call them the stone grave people, they lived here, but that was long, I guess, even before Columbus's day.
Now, in regard to the white settlers that came in, about what year were the first ones in here?
Well, I think some of them were Sooners. Like they've been good to go to Oklahoma because some of them eased in here early. Of course, Barron County, being south of the Green River, was held closed to settlement until about the late 1790s, for the simple reason that this land here was all surveyed by people like Edmund Rogers. Well, Daniel Boone was in here too. He was a chain carrier. And this was reserved for men who had served in the American Revolution. And they got grants, military grants. And so therefore they weren't supposed to be in here, but we had some who came in here earlier than that. And that showed up some years later in lawsuits because people came in here, they saw what they thought was a nice bit of land. They built a cabin on it. Some years later somebody arrived from Virginia carrying a deed to it for their bounty land, And we had a lot of lawsuits over that. And I'm sort of glad they did because they'd tell who their children were and things like that. It's really helped for genealogy.
Insofar as the records go for the first settlers, who were they and where did they settle?
Well, John Gorin probably is the best known. He settled by the Gorin Spring, which is the big, when I grew up, we just call it the Big Spring. And he lived...
And where is the Big Springs now in relation to today's environment? There are people that are living here now that have come from other areas and they don't know where the Big Spring
itself is under the parking garage, just down below the square there. Now it comes out, of course that's the reason Water Street's called Water Street. It comes out after you cross Broadway and then comes on down and eventually drains into the South Fork of Beaver down here. And of course that's the reason he settled there. Had a good big spring. They didn't have to dig a well. And so that was our main source of water in Glasgow for a long, long time. And in fact, it almost wiped Glasgow out because when the cholera epidemic came, it was spread by that spring. Now,
and when was that?
The cholera epidemic was, I think, 1854, thereabouts. About the middle of, 5 or 6 years before the Civil War. And we had a circus here. And where the Recreation Center and the Beulah Nun Park is on the square, there was a hotel there. And the stars all stayed up there. And one night, the people who were staying there heard all this moaning and groaning, and they got up and checked, and one of the circus people had the cholera, and he was in terrible pain. And so from there it spread, just like somebody one time was trying to see where the water that drained off the graves. In the graveyard went, they put dye in the water and it came out down in the Big Spring. So, where the water was coming from that they were drinking, right off the cemetery. But anyway, it almost wiped Glasgow out. In fact, they sort of quarantined the town. And finally, when the circus was able to leave, they got as far as Fountain Run before the disease just it just decimated them, and the circus broke up, and I wonder what happened to their animals lots of times. I don't know. But, and then Judge Hall was out here at Hall's Rich Grove. Now that's, if you go out Lexington Drive or the old Mumfordville Road, as soon as you cross there, I believe it's what Dr. Potts lives up there on that hill.
Yeah, he lives out there.
Yeah, that's part of the Hall's Rich Grove, but it extended on down to the where the so-called French restaurant, was later on, all up and down the creek there, and it was an extremely, like it said, a rich farm to be on, and it was just in the barrens. Therefore, they were able to get some timber. People weren't interested in the barrens much when they first came in here because there wasn't any surface water to speak of. If you stop to think about it, once you cross Beaver Creek, you go to Mumfordville and the Green River before you cross even a trickle.
And of course, the name Barrens came by virtue of the fact that there wasn't any timber.
Mm-hmm. And that was supposedly there, or at least they thought anyway, that the Indians were responsible for that because they used to burn it off in the spring. So the grass would come up and the buffalo and the deer would come here to graze. And we had buffalo here then. But when the white man came, the buffalo went. He didn't stay around here very long.
Now, other than Gorn, who were some of the early settlers?
Oh, Judge Hall, John, and all the Halls, there were several of them. John Matthews was one of the early settlers. And he was the one that, I guess, held every job that the county had to offer one time or the other. He cleared the courthouse yard. The trees and timber that they cut off where the courthouse yard is now, he had that contract. And he is the one supposed to name Glasgow. I believe it myself. I think he did name it. Some people say, well, it was named for Glasgow, Virginia, but I don't think Glasgow, Virginia even existed at that time. And he was a Scotsman. He's supposed to have been from over there. Now, we had a lot of other people who came into what then was Barren County that settled around Mill Creek, which is at Tompkinsville. And there were several very prominent families here. Some of them won't name an awful lot of them, but there were names that were really familiar, like the Eubanks were here early. They were clockmakers, silversmiths, and there were a lot of them like that.
Who laid out the city of Glasgow?
I would think that the fiscal court did that, or what would pertain to fiscal court then. That land was given to them by John Goring. I don't know who the actual surveyor was. I can't say. Now, of course, and talking about the early settlers, we had Edmund Rogers, but see, where he lived is now Metcalfe County. But he did most of the early surveying around here. But as to who actually laid it out, I can't say for sure. I know it's much smaller than it is now.
Yes, there's still maps of it available. I can't tell you off the top of my head who has a map of the early city when it was first laid out. I think maybe Henry Dickinson, Judge Henry Dickinson has one of those.
From north to south, Front Street. That was the beginning of the town if you were coming from the north. And when you got to, well, it's Bunch now, Back Street. And then, of course, when you went east, it was Common, which is now Franklin. And I guess Liberty was the western boundary. I'm not sure.
Well, in the beginning of the city and also the county, what were the main crops agriculturally, and also was there any livestock industry other than for personal?
Mostly personal, the livestock, with the exception of they soon got into horse breeding. That got to be a big thing. We had quite a few people, and of course their horses were fine saddle horses, like the Denmarks and some of those. They wouldn't have had probably a thoroughbred in those days because they wanted one that you could ride as well as race. Thoroughbred is just good for one race, but they did race the things. The race street, my understanding always was, and Vivian Russo and I have talked about this. I don't think she thinks that I'm right, but I do know that in the very early minutes of the town council of Glasgow, they passed an ordinance which made it illegal to race your horses on Race Street, on where Race Street is now. And I think that that's the reason they called it Race Street. But Race Street ended down just before you got the overall factory. People stop to think about it, you don't notice it, but there's a bridge there. And it used to, when you came into Glasgow, you had to turn onto Front Street and go down to Broadway and then back up Main Street to get up onto the square. But they raised some cotton. Corn was probably the big thing.
Corn was the big crop in the
And they made whiskey out of it.
Well,
But now that wasn't because they were such drunkards or anything, but you got to think about it. First of all, if anything that they had to sell that couldn't be marketed locally, they had a difficult time getting it to market. If you tried to carry it back across the Appalachian Mountains where they'd come from, well, you had to carry it on horseback, and as far as sending corn there, the horse would eat more corn than he could carry, so that didn't work. And so they would put in the flatboats. They built Port Oliver, where the dam is now, was the big jumping off place. And people go down there and they'd build flatboats, and they would load them up with whiskey, and they shipped a lot of pork out of here too. Hams and bacon, and cured hams and bacon and things like that, and some tobacco. Tobacco was not the crop that it later turned out to be, and not burley at all. It was dark leaf tobacco. People didn't smoke cigarettes. There weren't such thing. They smoked, if they smoked anything, they smoked a pipe or a cigar, or chewed, maybe even dipped snuff. But anyway, they did raise quite a few hogs here. For the simple reason you just turned a hog out and he just ate beech mast and stuff like that. I never ate any pork that was fattened on beech mast, but I've heard people say it was far superior to anything else that they had. But they'd load those things up in barrels, and they'd take them down there and load them up and take them to New Orleans and get out and walk back.
About what size were the farms between the settlement, the time of the settlement of the county and the Civil War?
They were much bigger than they are now. I don't know, I'm just going to hazard a guess, a minimum of, say, 250 acres. A lot of that was in timber. Now, when I'm talking about in cropland, In fact, probably the cropland wasn't as much as, it probably wasn't as farmed as much as it would be today, But there was worlds of timber here. And in the early days, timber was not a business. Later on, it became one. But in the early days of this county, they girded the trees, and when they died enough, they could cut them down, they piled them up and burned them. And they were talking about virgin timber, walnuts and things like that. I have a picture. Two of my mother's uncles were in the sawmill business. Now, this is before the turn of the century. And they're standing in front of this log, and it's higher than their heads, and it's the second cut. They had to heat weld 2 cross-cut saws together to saw that down. Now, we're talking about this is like in the 1880s and 90s. And so you can imagine what was here when they first came here.
Were there many slaveholders in the county?
Yes, there were several, but they not like you think about the Gone with the Wind type slaveholders with huge numbers of slaves, 1 or 2. Families would own 1 or 2. And it was very common to see the man, the slave owner and the slave working side by side in the field. And they had a relationship that I can't understand it. I don't think anybody can understand the relationship those people had in those days.
Where mainly were what part of the county were the slaveholders in? Was it the southern or the northern or both, or were they sort of localized?
No, they were scattered all around. Because there were just a few like that with each family, it was fairly widespread. Now, when you get over into places like what's now Monroe County, you had fewer slaves over there except along the river. You get along the Cumberland River, in those days. Now, you had fairly big slaveholders. I'm talking about maybe 8 or 10 slaves, But most of them around here just own 1 or 2. And for instance, this family would own a male, and his wife would be owned by one of the neighbors, and the man wouldn't even own a couple. Now we had several here in Glasgow. Most of them, I'd say, the biggest slaveholder we probably had in Glasgow was old Colonel Hayden Trigg, who developed foxhounds, and he lived in that big old house next to Trigg Court. I think it was Hawkins' place. He lived long down in there. And they were very early settlers, too. They were early settlers in Kentucky. They didn't get down here quite as fast as they did in some other parts, but they were early settlers. And that's the reason that we had a black section developed in Glasgow. It was because when the Civil War was over, he freed his slaves and he gave them the land that they lived on. And as other people who were freed from slavery decided to come to town, they went to that neighborhood. And that's the reason we still have a black section there, because of that.
Were virtually all of the early settlers from Virginia, or did you have some that came down the Ohio River out of Pennsylvania and
Very
then
few.
came south?
More Virginians than anything else. Now, some Carolinians, of course, I used to think that people came here directly from North Carolina and Virginia, but the thing was that the ones who came here, a good part of them stopped off in the bluegrass a few years before they got out here. We had, for instance, I know one man that was in the siege at Boonesboro that was here. And you know, old Major, that was at Blue Licks, think his name in a minute, Hugh McGarry. McGarry was here a while. And several people like that came down here. But I'd say still the vast majority of them came between 1800 and 1810. Now we have people come later, but I mean, most people here who can trace their ancestry back to that time would find that they came in from Virginia or North Carolina. You could almost draw a line sort of over here on the edge of where you could start to get into Monroe County and say just about everybody from there either came from North Carolina or East Tennessee, and people north of that came from Virginia. And that's not a rule, but you know, I mean, it's not uncommon. We had lots of Virginians here.
I would remind those of you who are listening that if you have questions for Mr. Simmons, please call 651-8341. He'll be glad to answer your question if he can, and if he can't, he'll probably look it up and we can get it answered later on.
Maybe nobody's watching.
Oh yes, there's people watching. As far as politics were concerned, and again we're talking about pre-Civil War, you had, of course, the Democratic Party was finally came out of the Republican Party, and you had the Federalists that developed into the Whig Party, all before the Republican Party as we know now, which was developed in 1854 or 56, I've forgotten which, by Fremont initially. But anyhow, politically speaking, what was the county in those days?
Mostly, I'd say the Whigs were at a majority. And, well, just to give you an example, in the election of 1860, least Arthur Crock, according to Arthur Crock, he said that Lincoln got 3 votes in Barron County. And in those days, you know, you came in and told them who you wanted to vote for, and you could get in a lot of trouble that way. He always said that old Squire Emmanuel Morris, his grandfather, stood up and voted for Abraham Lincoln, and at that time, of course, General Lewis wasn't a general, but General Lewis said, "You're my friend," but he leveled a pistol at him, said, "If you don't change your vote, I'll kill you," but he didn't. But, you know, we had, for instance, James Bell, who I guess you'd say was a very moderate Democrat. He carried this area. And one of the reasons maybe for it, I don't know, was that one time or the other he had a law partner, Franklin Goins from Glasgow. Maybe that's some influence anyway. But if you stop to think about it, Kentucky was neither carried by Abraham Lincoln, who was the Republican candidate, or the, I guess you'd say, radical Democrat or Southern Democrat candidate, John Cable Breckinridge. Neither one of them carried their home states. Bell carried Kentucky. And they were, but a lot of them, of course, they realigned because the Whigs went in the 50s, you know. Mm-hmm. But I think, if I'm not mistaken, General Lewis was a Whig. But they all eventually switched over to the Democrats. A lot of that was due to Reconstruction, you know. They reconstructed Kentucky just like it had been a big Confederate state. And the majority of the people in Kentucky were not Confederate-minded people, you know. But they treated them like they had been, and so to this very day that influences politics.
Well, generally now you get the impression, or one would who doesn't know of the history here, you get the impression that this was, the county as a whole was hotly Confederate.
Wasn't, no.
And there were areas, I understand, that were definitely for the North and Federalist. Can you sort of elaborate on that?
In the neighborhood of Fountain Run, which is, of course, you know, where 3 different counties come together, but then those people there, yet you go over just a little ways, from there to Tracy, and they called that Little Dixie. Tracy's not very far from Fountain Run, but that Fountain Run was a strongly Union section. The area around back in towards Slick Rock and out where Poplar Log, that area through there, along Glover's Creek, that was strong Union areas. Now your strongest Confederate area, I'd say, would be around Cave City and Park City over in there, and even over toward Hyattsville. They were very strong. But Glasgow was split, and I think that when Morgan's men used to come here, they always said that the people here were just as glad to see them as they were Unionists, because they were hometown boys, you know, as they were Confederates. They were welcomed. The women used to get up and cook breakfast. They cook all night long, so they could feed them a big breakfast the next morning when they got up.
About what was the population of Glasgow at the time of the war?
About 500.
About 500?
About 500. We had two, I guess you'd say, major industries. One of them was education, and the other was carriage making. We had quite a carriage building industry, and some of our citizens came here because of those two things. If I'm not mistaken, the Ganners came here. Old Professor Ganner taught music, and he came here because there were schools here. And the McEwens that are here, their ancestors came from Bardstown to build carriages.
Now, speaking of the educational aspect of it, can you elaborate as to how it developed? You said it was an educational center. When did it first begin to develop to be an educational center?
Well, it started several years before the Civil War. We had several, of course, everybody knows, I think, something about the normal school, but we had schools here for that. For instance, the Masons, they had the Allen Lodge, they had a school. They sponsored a school. Of course, you had Liberty College and Urania College, which was a woman's college. By the way, there weren't any co-ed colleges, and they were more like high schools, I guess, although they taught Greek, which is strictly Greek to me. But anyway, they had, like Urania, that was a sort of like a finishing school, and they, you know, you were from the sort of the landed gentry, the elite, if you went to schools like that. And then when this normal school came in, that was, I think, one of the bones of contention they had from the beginning. This Professor Mell, or whatever his name was, that wanted to started the normal school in here. He was a person who wanted to make education as cheap as he could, and also so that just you know, and wanted to educate anybody whether they were poor or not. And in those days, you didn't have to have too much education to teach school. What they'd do was they used to have what they'd call a cram school, and anyone who wanted to get to be a teacher, he'd come in and so many weeks, you know, and they'd study the old examinations, and then they'd take an examination. If they could pass, they could start teaching school. One of my mother's grandfather was a school teacher, and my mother's mother went to what they called a gab school or a blab school. I've heard them called both. And the way the students proved that they were studying, of course, that was a common school, that was a public school. And the way that they could prove that they were studying was they studied out loud. And if you weren't talking, as opposed to what people like to have now and everything, you might get a big switch across your back, you know. Yeah, you'd be sitting there doing your sums or spelling or whatever you're supposed to be doing. You better be making some noise. And those schools were supported by the local people, the people in their area. They used to have what was it they called it, that looked after them. They didn't have anything like a county board or anything, but there would be one man in the neighborhood who was elected to sort of be in charge of looking after the school.
They had trustees.
Trustees, that's what it was, trustees. Well, this Mel came in, by the way, they were paid those teachers from about $800 to $1,000 a year, which wasn't bad money. I can remember when I started at school, we had teachers that were making $85 a month. And so there wasn't an awful lot less than what teachers were making when I started school. But anyway, normal school was meant to train teachers. And
that's the predecessor of Western.
That's predecessor of Western.
Now, how did it happen that it got out of Glasgow and into Bowling Green?
Well, I think that when they put that here, the people in Glasgow were used to, you know, like I say, having schools for the sort of the upper crust, you know, and they didn't particularly like it, I don't think, to tell you from if you read between the lines. And but they were pretty successful, and they had the old the Urania College had gone under by that time pretty well, and they got the old Urania College building, which most people that can remember back to shortly after World War II will remember as the old Jackson Way Hotel, which stood at the corner of Front and Race Street, where that Shell service station is there now. Well, they occupied that building. By the way, that was the Glasgow grade school for years afterwards too. They occupied that building, and then they rented some buildings around there for dormitories and for dining purposes and things like that. But they were successful enough that when people started to come in here, pretty soon there wasn't any place for them to stay, and the people here just sort of ignored it. And I think that was probably one of the things that stuck in the craws of the people that ran the school. And finally, they just had grown so much. They didn't really ask the people in Glasgow to give them the school any money, but they said, well, provide more places for people to stay and things when they come here to board. And they weren't too interested in doing that. And so finally, this Professor Mell and Professor Williams, they were running the school, and they were strong-minded people and probably pretty good teachers. They said they were anyway. They said Mel could preach a different sermon every day and never, go back over in the territory that they had covered before. Of course, they had chapel every day, and everybody went to chapel. And the classes started out about daylight, and they studied Greek and all kind of wild things. I thought they had some business courses, and this might be interesting to some people. One of the big things that they pushed was penmanship. Now, if you wonder why that was pushed in a business course, just think about it. They didn't have any typewriters then. And all of that clerical work stuff and letters had to be written by hand. But anyway, finally they threatened to move the school to Bowling Green if they didn't come through and do something for them. Well, as it turned out, somebody said, well, and this is where the paper really got into it. Somebody said, well, this school belongs to Glasgow. You can't move it. Well, maybe they couldn't move the school, but they sure didn't move all the professors and all the students. And they tried to carry on for, several years after that, but it just gradually went downhill. But the main people, all the teachers, I think, and about 90% of the students took off and went to Bowling Green. And that was it. That's when we lost it. Of course, they said, well, it's our school. They can't take that away. Well, no, but they couldn't make it a success either. And so it just finally went down the drain.
So, in essence, it was lack of support of the...
Lack of support of the local people. They just wouldn't support it.
Well, when actually did the public school system get underway here in the county?
Well, we had it, a good while before that. We've always had public schools here since almost the very beginning, just like, for instance, the original courthouse was a log cabin that stood in the northwest corner of the square. And really all it was a clerk's office, but that's where they had the school. And I know in the very early minute books, if you get into the minute books, the fiscal courts, they were complaining because I guess the kids were making airplanes, something out of the court records and things in there, because evidently that only on court days or anything the clerk's office was open. Evidently they didn't stay open all the time, and it was used as a school otherwise. So we've had schools from the very earliest time, and it was a neighborhood type thing, though it wasn't. But now, as far as the state getting involved into it, about the middle of the 19th century, we started getting the state involved into regulating teachers and things like that, And the KEA started 1857, I guess. So we had teachers, being organized even in those days.
Now, there are stories about why we didn't get the L&N Railroad through Glasgow. What are the facts back of that?
Well, of course, the railroads first started in this country as early as the 1830s, but they didn't get to Kentucky until about the 1850s. And the L&N Railroad Company was formed, and they were going to run, of course, north and south, which they have today. Run through Park City and on down to New Orleans. And anyway, the route that they wanted was through Bardstown to Glasgow and on down to Scottsville that way, for more than one reason. One reason was that they said it would be easier to build a railroad there. It wouldn't be quite as, the terrain wouldn't be quite as rough. It wouldn't be as hard to lay the rails and things down. And then, too, they didn't want to go too close to Bowling Green because Bowling Green still had an awful lot of river trade. Now, I don't think that anybody came past Bowling Green like to Port Oliver anymore. Went back to the flatboat days, and they just went one way. But they did come to Bowling Green, and they thought there'd be a lot of competition if they got too close. But they figured, well, if it came down over this way, through Glasgow, it'd be a different story. Well, Ben Hardin, and if anybody's familiar with the counties in Kentucky, of course, Hardin County was named for that family, and they were intermarried with things like let's see, I think they were intermarried with the Beards and the Waters and different families around here. There's quite a few of them. And so, very prominent family. Well, Ben Hardin was prominent in politics. Hardin says, we'll get it anyway, regardless of whether or not, because what they wanted to do was to pass a tax and have all of these counties that would be served help pay for this railroad. And Hardin says, well, it's going to come this way anyway. So he beat the tax. Well, it didn't come this way anyway. Now, Metcalfe figures in this, but Metcalfe had already tried to break off several times. And when this thing came up, the precincts that made up what's now Metcalfe County, they voted against the tax. And somebody said in Barron County, said, well, if we help them go ahead and get their county over there, Barron County could pass that tax. Well, of course, these others were supposed to pass it too. Well, as it turned out, nobody passed it but Barron County. And finally, the county withdrew from it, and the people of Glasgow eventually had to pay for the spur that came in here. And now it's on the Civil War maps, but I don't think that they had actually laid any rails, because the Glasgow Railway Company didn't come in, the 1870s, I think. But that's what it was all about. It was money. Nobody wanted to pay for it, and Glasgow finally paid for the spur. And they had some promises from some other counties that had helped pay for it, but they all backed out, and Barron County backed out, and so the Glasgow had to pay for it.
But again, Warren County and the counties where the line did go passed the tax.
Oh yeah, they helped pay for it.
They helped pay for it, and that's why they got the...
That's how they got it over there.
How they got it.
Sirree.
And of course, we're still paying for the failure to get them here.
That's right, always will. No doubt about that.
Well, with that going into too many people that became prominent during the war, you've already mentioned General Lewis. Were there others here?
Yes. We had 3 people who were natives of this county that they got to be generals. One of the McFerrins, who was a regular Army officer, he got to be a general. The McFerrins lived out in the vicinity of the Glasgow High School. That old McFerrin place used to be out there. And he was a regular Army officer, and he was a veteran of the Mexican War, and he was a brigadier general. They used to have brevets, that it was a temporary promotion. He was a brigadier general in the Union Army. Well, of course, General Lewis, he raised the 1st Regiment, well, they didn't get a whole regiment raised here, and he was commissioned colonel, and then he ended up, when the other general, when the generals who commanded the Orphan Brigade or the 1st Kentucky Brigade were killed, he took command. And now this General William Martin, although he didn't leave here to go into the war, but after he graduated from Transylvania, he went south to Natchez and had a plantation there. And when the war came along, he became the ranking general from the state of Mississippi in the Confederate Army, from that state, from Mississippi. So there were 3 generals we had there. And then, of course, one time or the other, Lincoln's law partner was from Glasgow, and also Bell's, when, of course, he had Franklin going. We had some prominent people, and Joseph Rogers Underwood, who probably has been overlooked a lot, I think, anyway, because he was in the United States Senate at the same time Henry Clay was, when they had the great compromise of 1850. And he, even though he wasn't born in Barron County, he was Edmund Rogers' nephew, and he came here with Edmund Rogers, and he grew up in this county, and he practiced law here for a time, and he was in Transylvania when the War of 1812 came along, and he enlisted over there, and he was captured by the Indians up north, you know, we had all those forts that fell up there where they just gave up, you know, and the generals gave up, the men didn't. Anyway, and he had to run the gauntlet and was badly scarred the rest of his life. But he left here. He was involved in this Hamilton murder trial, and his uncle advised him to get out of it. He left here and went to Bowling Green, and from there, he, of course, was in the legislature, and from the legislature was elected to the U.S. Senate. And he was one of the founders of the American Colonization Society. And of course, they tried to buy up all the slaves they could and return them to Africa, you know. Of course, they couldn't buy them up as fast as when they got back over there, they started enslaving the native population and selling them.
Can you elaborate some on the Hamilton murder trial that you just mentioned?
That was the first one, I guess, we had in this county. John Hamilton, who was from a very prominent family, his father was Abner Hamilton. He was a Revolutionary War veteran and was one of the founders of the Cumberland Presbyterian Church. Anyway, he lived in what's now Metcalfe County, but it was Barron County then. And he'd been on a trading trip down south, down to Natchez. And on the way back, he rode up here with a Dr. Sanderson from Mississippi. Well, anyway, this Dr. Sanderson stayed with him for several days, and he was on a slave buying trip. And so he left John Hamilton's place, and later on in the day, his horse came back. And they got up a search party, and they searched and searched. Finally, what they found was they didn't have really have a corpse, but they found the top of a skull that had hair and brains with it. And then they found his hat nearby. And of course, he was the last one that had seen him alive, and they arrested him and indicted him. You couldn't even get it out of a grand jury today. It was all circumstantial evidence. But they tried him for the murder of Dr. Sanderson, and like I said, everything was circumstantial evidence. And then the jurors and things were people who knew him well, and supposedly, according to Hamilton, 2 or 3 of them had grudges against him. And anyway, they tried him and found him guilty of murdering Dr. Sanderson, and they were, like I said, they still didn't really have a body. And they erected a gallows, which is, well, it's not exactly at the corner, but where Leslie and Cleveland come together down in what I used to call, well, it used to be a tennis court down there, that hollow down there behind those houses. And that's where they hanged him. Of course, what made it really look bad, he had a brother named Adams Hamilton who tried to bribe the guards to let him out before he was hanged. But anyway, they hanged him down there. He had 2 old maid aunts that lived with him. They came to the hanging. They put his casket in a wagon. They sat on the casket, rode back over to Cave Ridge where they came from. His father hired every doctor in this country that they thought had any kind of reputation at all, and they worked over him for a long time trying to revive him. Of course, you know, when your neck's broken, you don't revive too well. And then he was buried in an unmarked grave, and it still is unmarked. I had an old lady take me to it one time, and I drove a stake in the ground, but I don't know if I could find it again now. But his contention was, he said that he was innocent, and he said if I had wanted to kill him, I came up to Natchez Trace where the Indians were killing people and the Harps brothers were killing people. I could have killed him then, and then no one would have known the difference. And a lot of it hinged around a pair of deerskin overalls. And that overalls then were a little bit different than they are now. But anyway, he had the testimony of there was blood on these overalls, and he had this slave who belonged to him, and he was ready to testify that he had borrowed these overalls without telling anybody to go to a dance, and got in a fight and got blood on them. But they wouldn't accept his testimony because he was a slave. And so, years later, there was someone from, I think it's one of the Russos from Kentucky that was in one of the embassies down in Latin America somewhere, and there was a planter there from Mississippi. And this planter said, when he found he's from Kentucky, said, are you familiar with the Hamilton murders, or Hamilton-Sanderson murder? And he said, yes, he was. And so he said, well, I was at a hanging in Mississippi a few years ago, and this man who was being hanged wanted to clear his conscience, and so he confessed from the gallows that he had been one of 2 men that escaped from the old prison at Frankfort, and they just happened to see Sanderson and killed him and robbed him. And of course they said, well, he had a list of serial numbers, by the way, in his hat In those days, states still could issue, state banks issued paper money. And these serial numbers corresponded to some money that they found with John Hamilton. Well, Hamilton did prove that he came to Glasgow and borrowed from a bank like so much money, you know. And what it was, he was going back to Mississippi where the money, the exchange rate wasn't as good on Kentucky money as and vice versa. Sanders was going to stay here where you couldn't get as much money for your Mississippi money, sees. So they swapped, according to him. Well, the two amounts were there, but they hanged him anyway. And I've always felt like he was innocent, but I don't have any proof of it.
There have been a few other major murder trials in Barron County. You care to talk about one or two of them?
Burwell Lawless probably was the next biggest one. He killed this boy whose name was Musgrove. I can't remember his first name now. Musgrove's, this gets involved with schools too, by the way. Musgrove's father was the town cobbler, shoemaker. And of course, Burwell Lawless was he was a real rich aristocrat. And he sent his daughter over here to Urania College to school, which when you think about it, that house was about where the high school is now. It wasn't very a long distance to go, but he had her boarding over here. See, she boarded. That was fashionable to board in the school, you know, where they had the young ladies were supervised and they were taught all kinds of things like how to pour tea and things like that too. Well, anyway, she met somewhere along the line. She met this Musgrove boy, and as my mother used to say, they worked up the case, and they fell madly in love. And they knew that the old man would never sit still for this, and so they eloped, and they went to Scottsville and maybe on into Tennessee. Well, when he found out that she was gone, somebody got word to him that she was gone. Well, he wind broke, I think, 3 horses getting there. But when he got there, they'd already gotten married. And they said, well, there's nothing you can do. We're married. We're legally, we have a license. Preacher has read the service over. We're now over us, and we're now married. He says, well, look, said, my daughter, I want her to have a real nice wedding and everything. He said, if you'll come on back home, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll let you have, a real wedding with a bridal gown and everything, see. But when he got her back home, that was it. He wouldn't let this boy come around out there. Well, the boy had a lot of friends around Glasgow, Musgrove did. Travis Cockrell was the county court clerk, and the sheriff was his big friend too. So, and my grandmother always said that they teased him about he was afraid to go claim his bride. Well, finally, he and a bunch of his friends got on their horses and rode out there. And he got down, then started up through the yard, and old man Lawless came out. He says, don't come in here. If you do, I'll kill you. And the boy just kept on, and so he shot him. Well, they said Travis Cockrell got so mad, the county court clerk, that he jumped down off his horse in the road. He didn't have anything else, and he started picking up rocks, and he rocked the old man. And they carried him inside, and they laid him out on the floor, on the carpet. Well, of course, he bled all over the carpet. And anyway, they always said that the girl cut the blood stains out of this carpet and kept them, you know, as a souvenir of her lost love. And she did marry some years later and move off to Louisville, but she committed suicide. It wasn't long till she committed suicide. And one of their, I guess, granddaughters married some nobleman in Germany. And it's a big, long von something name, you know, Prince von so-and-so. And they have some relatives over in there. But anyway, they always said the way he got out of it was that he bought one of the jurymen. And they said it cost him everything that he had. And in years to come, he said you could see him around town, and until his clothes at one time had, you want to remind anybody that wants to call that they can call?
Once again, we remind those of you who are listening that if you have any questions for Mr. Simmons, call 651-8341. He'll be glad to answer your question.
But they said his clothes at one time you could tell they'd really been fine clothes, but they were seedy, just like an old bum. And he told someone that if he had his life to live over again, he'd never killed him. He was awful sorry that he killed him because evidently it haunted him. Of course, now that's a that's typical of folk tales, you know. They all seem to, the murdered person all seems to come back after it's over and haunt the one who killed them, you know. I could tell you a lot of stories about that kind of thing, you know. But they always, it comes back to them and they're sorry they did it, you know. And they're on their deathbed and they see that this person they killed comes in, you know. But that broke him. And we've had some other things like that, even down to recent times. I know one of the Ritters was killed over there on the square, and he was beaten to death. The man who killed him beat him to death the two before. I don't know why he was after Ritter, but he had beat him up at the courthouse yard and left to get something to kill him with. And Ritter told him, says, he's going to kill me, don't y'all let him kill me. And the crowd just stood around and watched, and he went back and got him a 2x4 somewhere, came back and killed him with a 2x4.
Well, didn't Barron County have one of the last hangings in the state?
One of them. The last one was at Owensboro, but we came close to it. We had 2 men hanged here about the turn of the century, about the time of the Spanish-American War. Strangely enough, one of them was hanged for killing his father-in-law, and one was hanged for killing his mother-in-law. Bob Brown killed his father-in-law, and Franklin killed his mother-in-law. And they have a number of relatives still living. I've had some of them doesn't seem to bother them, you know, to know about it, but others it does. But it was family problems. For instance, as far as there was a case with Bob Brown of abuse in the family, and then with Franklin, he always claimed that his mother-in-law was responsible for he and his wife breaking up. I don't know. But now Franklin really had lots of friends in Barron County, because when they got out, of course, after he killed this woman, you know, they had people out hunting for him. And about 6 months later, he walked in and gave himself up. They thought he was, you know, in Texas or someplace. And he'd been hiding out. People had been feeding him things, and in people's barns and things like that. They'd let him sleep there and stuff like that. And, of course, probably the thing that did him in more than anything else was they went out to his farm, and there was a form of a human being that had been chalked on the barn, and he'd been practicing shooting at it. And that, I think, probably got Franklin more than anything else. And, of course, there's a little humor in everything, I guess. And being a person who doesn't like telephones much, I'll tell you this one. But anyway, when they got ready, now Franklin, he professed religion, and old preacher Brooks, who was the grandson of Jacob Locke, the early preacher that organized all these churches in Marion County and everywhere else too. Anyway, he professed religion, and they baptized him in a bathtub. And so he was ready to go, but on the way out, he decided that he wanted to apologize to the family for having killed his mother-in-law. And they had telephones then, and so he asked for permission to make a telephone call to apologize, and when he did, the line was busy. And I sort of think that's sort of funny. He never got to apologize to him.
We now have a call-in question for you.
I'd like for Jimmy Simmons to talk about the assassination of Solomon Sharp in 1825, and then I'd also like to hear him elaborate on Governor Leslie's term as he served the Commonwealth of Kentucky.
All right. Well, Solomon P. Sharp, of course, that was probably the most famous murder case in the state of Kentucky. You know, the writer from Guthrie, who was a poet laureate, I think his name in a minute, Robert Pitt Warren. You know, he wrote that book, World Enough in Time, and he changed a few things. He called Barron County Glasgow County and things like that. But anyway, Solomon P. Sharp was very prominent. Incidentally, Solomon P. Sharp, he was also prominent in this Hamilton murder case. And anyway, he was, I guess you'd say, a hero of the War of 1812, and he was very much into politics and had a lot of political enemies and everything. And he supposedly, at least she said he did anyway, there was a woman whose name was Cook, a maiden lady who lived in Bowling Green, and everybody thought she was strange because she took walks in the woods by herself and things like that, and then no, they didn't do that in those days. Well, anyway, she had a baby. She wasn't married, and she claimed that he was the father of this child. Well, he said it wasn't. then there were lots of talk about it and everything, and it painted her, you know, as being just sort of a loose woman. And the child died, by the way. Well, so a few years went by, and she met a man named Jeroboam Beecham. And that is a very common name in Metcalfe County, and they were related. Also, by the way, that's the same name as Bushon. One kept the pronunciation, the other one kept the spelling. But anyway, Jeroboam Beecham fell mad in love with her. And she said, all right, I'll marry you. He was younger than she was, by the way. She said, I'll marry you. But says, you've got to promise me that you'll kill Solomon P. Sharp if I marry you. So they plotted this thing, and they went to Frankfurt, and the tavern where he was staying over there, where he had a room, was run by the Lucketts. And some of those people live here now, you know. Miss Howard Malcolm Jones is kin to those Lucketts. You know, they ran this tavern, which in those days wasn't a drinking place. I mean, you know, it was like a motel. And anyway, they went there and called him to the door. And so when he came out, Beecham killed him. Well, I don't think they put two and two together pretty fast and got both of them. So they decided that they were going to have a suicide pact. And anyway, as it turned out, it worked for her. It didn't work for him, and they patched him up and hanged him. And that was probably the most famous case that we ever had in the state of Kentucky, because, like I said, people like Robert Penn Warren wrote about it. Governor Leslie was a case of a poor boy that made good. He started out, well, it was either in Wayne or Clinton over in there, that section over there, and then he moved into Monroe County. He practiced law. Of course, in those days you could become a lawyer, you know, by going and working with a lawyer, and you reading his law books and things until you were ready to practice on your own. A lot more rhetoric in there is now. You know, you didn't have to know the law so much. You had to be able to sway the jury. But anyway, he was elected governor from Barron County. He was the first. We had one other, of course, you know, Louis Nunn. And he tried to get elected again and didn't make it. But Grover Cleveland, Cleveland Avenue's named for, by the way, got elected president for the first time. And they hadn't had a Democratic president since James Buchanan, and they had a great celebration here over that and named that street for him. Well, anyway, Leslie, of course, was a Democrat and a big supporter of his, and he was appointed by Grover Cleveland to be the governor of Montana. And incidentally, Glasgow, Montana is bigger than Glasgow, Kentucky, but we can say that Glasgow, Montana was named for Glasgow, Kentucky. It was named in honor of Preston Leslie, and they're all still out there. Now, if you go up here in the cemetery, you can see the Leslie lot, by the way, which was damaged in that storm about a year or so ago. Those stones up there are not stones. They're made out of cast iron, and they were badly damaged by a tree blowing over, but there are none of them there. Those were put there sort of in their honor and their memory, but they're all buried out in Montana.
The governor himself is buried in
He's
Montana.
buried out there. I think he was sort of bitter when he didn't get elected governor a second time. Pretty fair governor, I think.
Now we were talking a little about the Spanish-American War around 1898, and that period. Were there many from Barron County that was involved in that?
We raised a company here, which they call the Rayleigh Rifles. You remember some of them. We were talking about Bob White earlier. Bob White was a corporal and a character. And Uncle Sid Bowles. Some people may remember Uncle Sid Bowles, because when I grew up, I heard all about Monday Bowles and Tuesday Button. Now, they brought two little boys back from Cuba. They picked up two little orphan boys while they were down there. And Uncle Sid Bowles, who was, well, I noticed he lived on the second house as you come on to Cleveland, from up there by the Triangle, you know, off of Leslie. He lived in the second house. The first house is where Miss Durwood Haynes lived. And I don't know who's going to live in this one. I noticed they're putting a new porch on it. And Uncle Sid was a little short, sort of dumpy fella, and he loved children. He would sit out there on the porch, and as we'd go home from school, he'd call you to come up there and sit on those steps and talk to you. And he was in there, and of course the last one that we had was Chase Edmonds. Now, he hadn't been dead maybe about 15 years, I guess. Chase lived quite a long while. The captain of that company was Fleming G. Raley, who was a Presbyterian preacher. And a lot of the men didn't like him for some reason. And after the war was over and they'd parade, they wouldn't march with him. He had been a Confederate soldier, incidentally, under General Lee over in Virginia, but he was real young at the time. Now, we also had a company raised here called the Moss Minier Guards, but they had so many more volunteers than they needed. They never called them, but the Moss Minier Guards was a black company. And on Memorial Day of 1898, of course, the war started in April, and on the 30th of May, they were very prominent in the Memorial Day celebration or commemoration here. They paraded, but they never called them up. We had some in the regulars.
We have another call-in question for you.
Yes, Mr. Simmons, I have heard so much about a place called the Runaway Camp. Where was it, and what exactly was that? Thank you.
Well, that was south of town here. I wish Marion Vance could be here because he could pin upon it for you. But it was south, down in the Lucas area, sort of. And it was where that we had people here that were anti-slave people. There was even, I forgot who it was now, somebody even wrote a book against slavery here. And there were people who left here and went to Illinois and Ohio and Indiana because they were free up there. But anyway, slaves from down south would come up the Underground Railroad, which was neither underground nor a railroad, but and I don't know that it was any one route that they took, but that was one of the routes that they took, and they'd stop down there. I'd say it's not far from the cabin, what they call the cabin field, which evidently was where there was a fort down there. But it's down in there around Lucas. I wish Marion was here, he could tell you, because Marion, plotted it all one time, and I kept after him to publish it. He was going to do it next fall or next spring or next fall or next spring, and it'll never be done now, I don't guess.
Well, was it Barron County people that were in charge of that, or did they come in here from somewhere else?
No, there was people, local people here that were really anti-slavery. I tell you, we were talking about the papers names out of the Jones family. William Henry Jones, Wren Jones, and some of the Grinstards that lived out there in the vicinity of 88 and back into that country out there. They were really strongly anti-slavery people here. But I'd say the majority of the people weren't concerned one way or the other. But we did have people who it was just it was a crusade with them. But most of a good part of those people, and I've seen letters that some of them that went out in the Illinois places wrote back and they talk about how they're where everybody's free and there's no slavery and stuff like that. But there are lots of people that left here because of that, to get away from slavery. And there are others, when they moved where there was slavery for that same reason. I mean, the opposite reason, I mean.
We have got a lot of territory that we could still cover, and we haven't got a whole lot of time left. Do we have another question? We are gradually getting up to World War I, and we haven't covered a lot of material that could be covered before we get to World War I. And one of the subjects is, well, I believe this occurred after World War I, but anyhow, the night riders. Did we have any night riders here in Barron County, and explain how that came? Of course, it was evolved out of the pool situation for dark tobacco. That was after World War I. Yeah, in the early 20s, was it not?
A lot of their trouble was there before the war.
It was there before?
A lot of trouble before the war, yeah. Probably closer to the Spanish-American War than it was to the First World War. We had some here, but nothing here. They used to have they used to scrape people's plank beds and do a few things like that. If we had any barn burning, I don't think that I ever heard of it. Of course, now west of here, it was really bad. The whole situation was bad when you get right down to it, because they didn't have tobacco markets like we have tobacco markets now. It was all at that time as well, I'm gonna say all. Most of it was dark tobacco. Burley really started after the Spanish-American War along in there. And the reason it did mainly in here was because the hemp market. The Spanish-American War knocked it out because they could get Manila, which was far better than what they raised here. And then, too, I don't know whether people smoked that stuff then or not, but I know in World War II when they raised it here because they couldn't get Manila, the federal agents watched it very close. But they went from, because it became non-profitable, they went from that to tobacco. But before that, they went to Burley, it had all been that dark fire-cure tobacco because people chewed and people smoked cigars and pipe tobacco, things like that. But we never got into quite like they did. But anyway, what I started to say about it was, instead of you getting your tobacco and coming into market and them having an auction and people bidding on it, that'd be a buyer come out to your place and he'd look at your tobacco and say, I'll give you so much for it. And if you didn't take it, it hung there. And that was what brought a lot of that about. But we didn't have the trouble here that they had west of here. But it was bad when you get over into Trigg County and Christian County, that area over there were people killed. They burned barns, their people were whipped. Around here they scraped a few plank beds and things like that. I don't think they set any fires. They might have. I never heard of it if it did.
Very quickly, and primarily with a yes or no, and we might have this for another time, but was the Ku Klux Klan ever in force here?
Very prominent here. After World War I, it was almost a status symbol. I could tell you some of the people that are in it that were very prominent citizens in Glasgow. And
well, with that, we will terminate this session, and perhaps sometime down the road, and maybe not too far, we would like to have you back, and we'll take up where we left off.
Okay.
Thank you very much. We appreciate it.
You're welcome.